Thank you so much, Emily. It's always fun to attend these open source days. I am perpetually nervous, so please bear with me. If you know me from any of the previous presentations that I've done, you'll notice that I take a little while to calm down and get my bearings. But it's lovely to be in front of you today to talk a little bit about our project, open source. Our open source project, open job description, and how we built that at the same time alongside a commercial product called AWS Deadline Cloud. Just a quick check, is anybody in the wrong room? This is the presentation that you expected to see, hopefully. Okay, great, cool, woo, all right. Yeah, shout out to Song of the Summer, VDB. It's just amazing. Okay, so let's get going. For fans of the series, I always like to have a little bit of an agenda. So here's what we're going to be doing for today. First of all, we'll go through a little bit of introductions for myself and Daniel, and then I'll reintroduce open job description and put that into context in terms of AWS Deadline Cloud. So you don't need to remember anything. You don't need to go back and quickly check up on what we talked about last time. We'll get that situated for you. We're going to talk a little bit at a high level on some of the assumptions that we made in terms of operating as an open source development team inside a commercial paid team at AWS. And then we'll tell you a little bit of a story in 3 parts, in 3 decisions about how we made it happen. And then, of course, there'll be time for Q&A, hopefully. Yes, okay, sorry. Breathe, Pauline. Okay, so let's jump right into it. And I'll start by letting Daniel introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm the architect for Open Job Description. I hope you like it. I'm also an engineer on Deadline Cloud, and in previous lives, I've done stuff with ray tracing, stereo vision, taught undergraduate computer science at a university, and before AWS, of all things, I was in compiler optimization. So really strong VFX creds there. Back to you, Pauline.
Yep. And as you've heard before, I'm Pauline Koh. I'm a senior product manager, technical at AWS. And my previous background was mostly in visual effects and feature animation, production services companies, and startups, both small and large. Small ones like Google, for example. Together with Daniel, we open sourced open job description, first the specification in January, then we followed up with a toolkit release in February, and then 2 months later, on April 2nd, we also launched AWS Deadline Cloud as well. So busy time this year. Okay, so a quick refresher on open job description, brief refresher on sort of what we were trying to achieve. Open job description is a specification designed for describing any content production compute job to run in a portable fashion. And the reason why we want to do that was to improve interoperability and modularity in content production pipelines. One of the key things that we identified over the course of a couple of years, and certainly across the team of ThinkBox Deadline, of both which we are a part, we thought that it was really difficult for people to consider multiple compute solutions because there's a lot of proprietary code that goes into describing how those jobs work and how those tasks work for every single solution. So the green parts here are handled by Open Job Description in terms of the artist or the pipeline tool can create a job, define a job using the standard, and then any of these compute solutions on the right-hand side will be able to leverage them to actually execute on the job. So how does Deadline Cloud fit into this then? Well, if you consider one of the compute solutions being Deadline Cloud uses Open Job Description in terms of having the work defined in that format, and then interprets it to break it down into the actual instructions to be run on the host by the worker agent. Remember to breathe, Pauline. Okay. Any questions so far? We're on the same page? Pauline's not too nervous for y'all? Okay, great, cool. Let's keep going. One of the guiding design principles that we kept as a North Star is Deadline Cloud is what we imagine a render farm built for open job description should be. So that's sort of like something that internally we kept as like a guiding vision. Okay, so after that brief refresher, I think we have the context now to start talking a little bit more about balancing business versus open source development and the fundamental need to sort of make this our day job and what that can bring in terms of your projects. Okay. So just a general note of caution, we do make some assumptions here, but we can discuss those as well. We've left some time, but we'll also be talking about some examples too. So hopefully it's not too generalized. Oh, whoa, oh. Okay, calm down, breathe. I got this, okay. The first challenge that I'd like to describe is probably the first one that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think about doing open source development in a large business. Priorities. And so really this is about telling a good return on investment story with your business stakeholders. The tension here comes from what we found a lot of times is in a business, you sort of prepare like a justification for what you're about to do before you can actually go and do it. Otherwise, you get into trouble. Whereas I think a lot of times you can really bias for action in an open source project by just doing the thing and then submitting a pull request, and then approval will come if the pull request is accepted. And so if you, I guess, like make up your mind that this is a good thing to do, it's really, really helpful, and I'll get into why a little bit later as well. Another one here is policy compliance. And so being part of a business, we have a lot of rules to structure sort of our responsibilities and how we interact with external folks, including things like information disclosure and compliance for regulatory responsibilities that we have as part of doing business. Whereas in open source development, a lot of times we need to resolve those into the practicalities of project governance and private commercial use cases, and really how do we make good decisions together while sort of collaborating in a more loose fashion. Then, of course, once you start developing, there's still friction, and this is where I'll pass back to Daniel.
All right, so there's a bit of a line to walk around setting expectations. So in a business, your users are in a commercial relationship with you, so they expect everything you touch to be supported in the same way as the thing that they paid for. But in open source, there's more freedom in that users accept things are as is but can be improved. So there's a challenge around what bar to set when you're putting things out for open source, especially coming from a business. So at the extremes, either you're spending too much time polishing and maybe not delivering as much, or you're putting out a ton, but maybe you're disappointing your paid customers, right? And so you got to try to figure out where that line is. But we've talked a lot about challenges, but there are some benefits to being part of a business. And back to Pauline.
Thank you. So really, we speak about challenges, but challenges are good. It helps to guide and make sure that we're doing the right things. There are some counterintuitive, or maybe it was counterintuitive to me, but maybe you're all very familiar with this, but it helps to have the ability to do this as our day jobs. For example, one thing that is helpful for us that we found is that we had specialist professionals that once we justified the business case, could dedicate their time to helping us out. And so oftentimes when we talk to folks who are working on projects, they'll say that it's kind of hard to recruit these resources and retain them for their services, and it could be a trade-off that impacts their ability to develop specific features. So we kind of get that out of the box if we've made that justification like we talked about before. Another thing that's great sometimes is the focus on helping an end customer or helping resolve a real customer problem. And so one thing that just naturally happens as being part of a business is we talk about who needs this, who's going to use it, what's going to happen with it in a very structured way. And so specifically, this can help if there's a tight timeline. It kind of cuts down and time boxes sort of all of the discussions that can really go into the weeds and the edge cases. Whereas I think in open source teams, and again, this is an assumption, I do apologize, let's talk about it. Oftentimes, passion and interest are key motivators, which means that there can be a lot of work happening at the same time, but maybe not the most important issues are getting resolved in sort of that priority order. One more thing is collective wisdom, and this may be just an artifact of our scale, but there is a lot of collective wisdom over at AWS, and we do have a lot of relationships that we can leverage when it comes to doing research as well, and this includes relationships that are commercial, so partners and customers, we literally have their contact information and we can reach out and talk to them and they have a reason to talk to us. It does help. But I think sometimes with open source development, there's effort that needs to be invested in growing and building a community and finding those helpers, which is why structures like the Academy Software Foundation can be so useful because they act as a way to bring those resources together as well. But to talk a little bit about getting noticed, I'll hand back over to Daniel.
I promise I do more than one slide at a time. Once justified, we get resources to do fun things like attend conferences and talk to fine folk like you. But on the business side, there's a whole machine ready to roll to support getting a word out about our product, right? It's the business. If they're not getting the word out, they're not selling things. But in purely open source, you might not have that available outside of large organizations such as the ASWIF or Linux Foundation. So we think that assistance in getting the word out is part of what makes things like ASWIF, the resources and product structure, very valuable and very important. But up until now, we've talked about challenges and benefits that we need to balance. In the next part, we're going to talk about what decisions we made while balancing those things. We had to make a lot of calls when building this stuff out and thought they'd be interested in a little bit of a window into some of the thought process behind it. To start, I'm going to talk about portability. So I don't think it's a secret, at least I hope it's not. If it is, we haven't been doing a good job, that we're very ambitious in our desires for open job description. The vision, if you want to follow me here, you're in a world where pipeline automation and tooling for your render farms is general, open sourced, and shared. Gone are the days where you have to reinvent the same tools just because you moved studios or switched render farms. And we think portability is an essential aspect for that vision. Right. We're also trying to minimize requirements on the tech stack in this particular design by expressing jobs as commands run with arguments, kind of your lowest common denominator. And we're basing our implementation on needing a little more than just Python to run. And we also, this might be surprising for coming from AWS, we have a hard rule in the design, no cloud tie-ins, period. So that means that you can use it off of AWS, you can use it you can use it on your workstation. We don't think this can become a broad standard if you can only use it on AWS. So I think that rule is particularly important. But regardless of how elegant the specification is, how good I am at writing things, that means we need to build more things to make the specification useful to you, right? We're practical people here in the room. We like to get our hands on things, try them out, see where they break down, see where they're awesome, see how to improve them. That means we need to accompany the paper spec that we released with actual tooling and libraries that you can build with and need to think through how you will use them when we're deciding how to architect that code and libraries. For instance, things like the parser, hopefully, won't have as many changes and fixes as something like the runtime, which needs to manage processes on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. And if anyone's done that, whew, that is hard. So if you're writing a translation tool, we don't want to spam you with irrelevant new change logs every time that we update the runtime, and vice versa, right? We intentionally built code packages that are very focused in purpose and made those open source. That way you have the same toolkit that we are using to use Open Job Description. Our improvements to that toolkit help you, and ideally any improvements you make also help us. As a bonus, a result of this strategy is that you can use Open Job Description today, right now, on your workstation without ever touching Deadline Cloud or AWS for that matter. But of course, if money were infinite and I had a pocket dimension that was time dilated, all of this would be super easy, but they're not, so we had to prioritize. And Pauline is going to talk about that next.
Yes, our technology around pocket dimensions is not yet generally available, so we can't really confirm or deny. Part of the reason why we trade off so often is I need to get my steps in for the month, so, bear with me for a second. All right, cool. So, really, part of making sure the rubber meets the road, so to speak, is that we were building Open Job Description and Deadline Cloud to release around the same time, which made the roadmap planning for both a little bit tricky. It was imperative that Open Job Description remain useful and worth implementing outside of Deadline Cloud, as Daniel just mentioned. But on the other hand, AWS pays all my bills, or all of our bills, really. So we had to make sure that Deadline Cloud was getting what it needed. So in the end, we treated Deadline Cloud as our first product, which uses OpenJD. We prioritized critical Deadline Cloud needs over nice-to-haves. However, we also used our feedback from our previous talks, from our GitHub issues, and our conversations with others who have built similar things to help OpenJD be independent. This was still a balancing act, a juggling act, as every step required justification. Feedback from the overall community on Open Job Description was extremely useful in justifying investment for OpenJD as an open source release. One example of that is the CLI that Daniel just mentioned. So you can run this on the workstation. There's no need for a render farm at all, and therefore Deadline Cloud didn't need it, right? We felt that this was critical, though, for it to be a useful open source project for users outside. But the truth is, oh, sorry, messed up my notes. We didn't think OpenJD could be successful if we didn't prioritize this feature independently of Deadline Cloud. But in the end, the decision still ended up being really helpful because it increased our ability to debug on the fly and iterate parts of the service. We use it all the time. So I think it was a good choice.
Another example is how Open Job Description handles environments. The sessions feature, if you're familiar at all with the spec, is one of the foundational concepts in Open Job Description. We started work on it really early, and the capabilities we developed in Open Job Description actually ended up informing features and priorities in Deadline Cloud as we cooked up new things in the lab. In fact, the large investment in sessions from the feedback loop between OpenJD and Deadline Cloud got noticed and called out in our discussion forums in January, just after we released. When people noticed that this thing looks like it's had a fair bit of bake time. Oh, right, she's back to me again. I get more than one slide. Now that it's out there, Deadline Cloud remains the only major implementer so far, hopefully. So it's still driving a lot on the roadmap, but we're shifting towards community features, so we'd love to talk to you if you're interested in working with us on Open Job Description. The stuff we're trying to do to make this real improvement in interoperability and modularity for content production pipelines can't be done if we're the only ones working on it. There are use cases we don't know about, edge cases we can't predict, We need your voices to help us make business justifications that Pauline just mentioned in a way that our leadership can digest if they are not Darren Grant. And back to Pauline.
Yeah. So really come to the GitHub, join us, and make sure your needs are met. The whole team, not just Daniel and I, are really watching these discussion forums, as we just mentioned. Talk about what is important to you, right? Like, is it richer expressions? Is it more task grouping options? Is it more dependencies? All right, I should stop talking. Do we have time for questions? I think we do.
Maybe?
Yes. Cool. So time for questions. And also, please feel free to exercise the link to join us on our GitHub. We did it! Okay.